Today, obviously, we are talking about women in insurance, the sort of challenges they face, how it's sort of changed over the years, and then our lovely panel are going to talk about how basically we can address those changes and sort of push that positive change. So I'm going to start by giving a sort of introduction to the sort of scope of the market, just sort of key challenges that obviously do occur in sort of terms of representation, gender pay gaps, attitudes towards women, etc., etc. And then Melanie, an associate at Elborne Mitchell, is going to talk a bit about gender bias, just give a sort of introduction to that. And then Caitlin, Kaj, and Gemma, wherever you are. There you are going to join me on the panel to sort of talk about how we can basically push those changes and actions for fairer equality. So yeah, there will be time for questions at the end, so if you could refrain from asking the panel questions until the end when there'll be plenty of time, just so we sort of stick to timings, etc. So yeah, obviously women are increasingly playing an important role in the industry. We're starting to see a lot more representation across the board, but there obviously are challenges still pertaining to sort of gender pay gaps, like I said, attitudes, and sort of the seniority gap that obviously are still quite prevalent. So yeah, the insurance industry does employ 400,000 employees on average. However, only 35% of them are female, which is currently quite below the sort of average in every other industry. And then if you go up to the board, you've obviously got only 29% of female senior executives, which obviously is a massive push from, say, 5 years ago, but obviously still shows that women are sort of scarce in the sort of higher positions of power. There is obviously positive change occurring, with obviously 66% of sort of graduate entry-level people obviously are female, which shows that a lot more is being done in terms of obviously attracting the younger talent. However, in terms of broking especially, only 8% are CEOs, as well as 5.4% hold a chair position. Although this doesn't obviously come as a shock, seeing the figures are obviously quite low, I think it's obviously extremely disappointing and sort of proves the archaic perceptions around sort of gender bias mindsets, and it's still extremely prominent. Obviously, as many would argue, these figures are influenced by sort of a number of factors. The fact that obviously women feel like they're less deserving of roles, there's a lot of stuff around maternity, and obviously they have to choose between family and obviously advancing their career. And obviously that they think they're less sort of deserving of the roles. For example, if I said to you, CEO of my company, you'd obviously automatically assume it's a man, and especially in a sort of male-dominated society and industry, obviously that is even more prominent. As well as the gender pay gap. The gender pay gap at the moment stands at 25%, which means obviously there's a lot more to be done in terms of that. Obviously there's a lot of external factors influencing this unequal gender pay divide. I think the discrepancy of pay is obviously influenced by the fact there are obviously inadequate levels of females in the higher positions. And yeah, so yeah, next slide, Charlie, sorry. Also, in terms of retention levels, I think it's not just about obviously action and fair representation across the board. I think we also need to look at how we obviously retain these females. If you can't just tick a box and say, you can become the CEO, you need to really empower them. So a study by McKinsey basically showed that every woman promoted to director level 2 resign. As you can see on the board, there's more women leave their company. If their company's committed to D&I, more female leaders are obviously likely to be mistaken for someone junior, and obviously the gap between men who are promoted to women is obviously extremely low. So if we take all of this on board, my question is basically that how do we action fair representation across the board and sort of push these challenges, but also how do we retain these females to create a positive, empowered and motivated workforce? So I'm going to invite Melanie up to talk more about gender bias.
Well done, Zoe. Welcome, Melanie.
Thank you, Zoe. That's really interesting, and I think what I'm going to talk about, and hopefully it'll give you a lot of food for thought, will feed into what Zoe has spoken about and produce some good conversation later on. So there's been lots of discussion about unconscious bias in the papers, obviously mostly thanks to our royal family, mostly in the context of race, but obviously we see a lot of it in the workplace, and I'd say probably in more proportion in respect of gender. And there's still a lot of misunderstanding around what is unconscious bias and what it means to be unconsciously biased as well. But I think also the manifestations of unconscious bias So how it presents itself then later on to somebody else is often underestimated, and that's a huge problem, and leads to the type of statistics that Zoe has just shown us. So essentially, unconscious bias are the views and the opinions that we all hold, but are unaware of, and they can come out of your background, your culture, the context in which you work, the context in which you were brought up, and are automatically activated, and it's often you will not even notice that you either hold one or that you're activating some sort of manifestation of it. And the first step really to obviously understanding or stopping the manifestation of it is to understand that you have an unconscious bias. And the question really there is, how can you address those? And I'd say the first thing is to kind of look at your echo chamber that you create around yourself. So, look at your Instagram feed, look at your Twitter accounts that you follow, and really start pushing those boundaries into places that actually make you feel a bit uncomfortable, and sit with that uncomfortable feeling and kind of, really just experience that and see why you hold that kind of uncomfortable feeling, and see where you can kind of push that. There's a lot of academic and I think also maybe lay debate about whether unconscious bias is an ism, racism, sexism, ageism, and I don't know, that might feed into some of the conversations that you have later on, but it is an interesting idea. Is holding an unconscious belief, is that enough to warrant somebody as being racist, sexist? Or is it the manifestation and then not acting on that manifestation when it's been pointed out to you? Is that where the ism comes in? So again, it kind of feeds back into this misunderstanding of what it is as a concept, and how seriously we should or shouldn't be taking it. Baroness McGregor Smith, in her 2017 review of race in the workplace, she noted there that unconscious bias is now much more pervasive than what we used to see in the 70s as a conscious, deliberate discrimination that we used to see, and that we're all now very acutely aware of and sensitive to. So now it's this kind of unconscious bias and how that manifests itself that is really the insidious problem that we have in our culture and also in our workplaces that we have to address. So sometimes it's easier to kind of discuss unconscious bias in looking at kind of the context of the workplace as examples. I had a look at the Harvard Business Review, and they did a general kind of review of gender bias in the workplace, and they came up with these types of examples, and specifically in respect of gender bias. So female colleagues on the whole being spoken over much more than male colleagues, and I actually saw there was a review of an academic review in the States that found exactly the same thing, that tutors and teachers would much more often speak over female students rather than male. There's also greater emphasis on delivery and emotional response in appraisals. Rather than with men, you would look more at the output as opposed to how you're achieving that output. So that was quite an interesting thing, particularly when if you are managing an appraisal, we need to be conscious of that and any kind of manifestation there. Women are more likely to be asked about their future family plans. We've got a lot of very young females here, but I'm sure some of us will have thoughts about perhaps taking our wedding rings off, going into an interview, for example. But it's still a very common assumption that females will have to take a conscious decision between career and family life, whether or not that they're likely to want to have children in the future. Women feel mindful to express authority and downplay their accomplishments. That was found by the Harvard Business Review. And it also found that even where women were well represented in their industries, there's still kind of a boys' club mentality where decisions at top level, or even any senior level, was made by men. There's also a mention of lack of mentors, sponsors even, or those types of allies throughout the workplace. But I think it's also important to consider the bias. We always kind of automatically, I think of a bias being a negative bias, but some of them are positive biases, and they can also lead to detrimental impact on some people within the workplace. So it's also, really you need to think about your bias towards different genders, towards different races, whether they're positive or negative, and see whether there's an impact of that positive as well as negative bias on any group within the workplace. And it's really nice to see so many men here, actually. I just assumed that it would be mostly or much more female-based. But I think that raises an important point that men shouldn't be forgotten in the conversation of gender bias. Because in order to raise women up, you always have to raise the men up. Men are often seen as, they cannot be sensitive. I've got a 5-year-old girl, and all of the T-shirts, looking at 5-year-old kids, the boys are branded brave, strong, and the women are princess. But I think it's as problematic, the male branding, as it is the female branding. And until we address the position of the men in the workplace as well, to a certain extent, we're not going to be able to address that of the female counterparts. So I am an employment lawyer, so I can't resist a bit of employment law. But I think it's a good idea to have a think about where the law assists, but also to push that further and to think, well, yes, the law is there for to ban any prohibited conduct in relation to to protected characteristics, and gender being one of them. But is it enough, actually? And that, I imagine, is going to be addressed by the panel in due course. So we've got 3 main types of prohibited conduct when you're looking at the grounds of sex. The first being this direct discrimination. So A cannot treat B less favourably because of their gender. And you usually see that kind of employed where there is direct, obvious discrimination. So really, the more useful tools when you're looking at unconscious bias are harassment, and harassment's particularly important one to really consider in the workplace, because where one other person subjects another to unwanted conduct that has the purpose, and this is the key word here, or effect, of creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment. I always have to read that bit. That's where you get harassment. That's a harassment claim. So you'll see that, yes, the purpose in some cases can be enough to for the prohibited conduct to arise, but it doesn't have to be the purpose of somebody. It doesn't have to be the intention of somebody to harass somebody else. If the effect is to create an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment on the other person, that is enough. So that that can be an incredible tool, actually, when it comes to unconscious bias, because the fact that somebody's bias is unconscious often will mean that they didn't intend to cause that offence necessarily, but if the effect was such, then you have a claim against that person and or the employer, potentially. Indirect discrimination is one that I think we're going to hear more and more about, particularly with hybrid working, lots of working from home, because more and more women who have generally the childcare and responsibilities in the home will be taking up their employers on the options of hybrid working, and so you will start seeing, I think, a lot more indirect discrimination claims arising out of that. So you can see it is a useful tool, the law, and it can be a deterrent, but because I think gender in particular bias and gender discrimination is so insidious and so subtle in a lot of places, and I don't just mean the workplace, I think overall throughout the society, I think it requires a lot more, and again I think this is where the panel will come in to discuss what can be done, because the law of certainly isn't enough. And I'm going to leave you with a really depressing figure here, that so the World Economic Forum has predicted that the gender gap in the workplace is going to take 268 years to close. And I think what's even more depressing is that that's an increase from 230 from before the pandemic. So I'll let that sit with you.
Well, thank you very much.
And yeah, a more positive discussion will come out of this.
Thank you very much.
I think that's extremely shocking to hear, but thank you very much for that. I'd like to invite the panel up now to take your seats. We're in order. We'll pay attention. Well, perfect. Well, thank you very much for coming, guys. We've got Payne, who's the partner at Elborne Mitchell. Caitlin, associate at Willis Towers Watson. Kaj, who's a manager at DA Strategy and also chairs up the MGAA Next Generation. And Gemma, a business director at IDEX Consulting. So, yeah, the panel are going to obviously be talking about the challenges we addressed before and basically explaining how they personally think as us as individuals and as a sector can push that positive change to champion a fairer workforce. So my first question to you guys is, obviously we have discussed the challenges already, but what do you believe are the biggest challenges facing women in insurance at the moment? Is it anything we just discussed, or could you think of anything else?
Shall I go?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, I think we're in a very interesting time at the moment. I mean, I've been in the market for over 30 years, but the place has changed. But at the moment, I think there is this energy, you know, there is something going on where there's been a focus, you know, in the press, amongst people, by the regulator, which is a very energising bit of energy. So I think there is this bubble of energy, but I think the challenge now is to actually seize that energy and to really try and take us forward in a meaningful way. Because the sort of very superficial changes, I think, are all over the place. So, you know, we have gone some way, but a number of the changes, I think, are actually quite superficial. And so I think the challenge is very much to you know, to try and convert that energy into something real. And I mean, my view is that one of the key fundamental things that we need to focus on is actually educating people, training people. I know that sounds really boring, but actually lots of the things that Melanie talked about, these aren't the sort of things that people actually know about. You know, we're working in this space where people do need to sort of have, you know, we all need to be educated, and that's men, that's women, that's very senior people, and so I think that, you know, that's one of the challenges.
I follow on from that and thinking that bringing women into discussion at all levels is also like crucial. I notice, like personally for myself, that often decisions still are made in a very male typical way. So it'll be on a golf course, it'll be in a pub where you're either not invited to because it's not as easy for men to bring you in the conversation, you can't just have the standard type of chat they'd like, or you've got childcare, so you're not there to make decisions, not your face isn't around, there's no representation of you. So I think if we can, again, educate men and women about how we merge it more, so people are all sat together and actually can like develop forward that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think definitely there's, you know, I think people here would have heard of the motherhood penalty. So I think there's definitely, that's a big challenge in our market. I was talking to my director the other day and he said, actually previously you'd expect people, once they have children, especially women, they would just retire from the market. You wouldn't expect them to come back. Obviously now that's changing massively, but back in his day, 30 years ago, he said that was the norm. So I think there's still some level of that bias existing today. So I think that needs to disappear a bit. I think you need to be more empowering of people when they come back from maternity leave and be more accommodating. So if somebody wants to work part-time or work from home, I think COVID actually has helped with that. I think now people can see that working from home is an option and is realistic, whereas previously, especially in insurance, nobody would work from home. Everything was very face-to-face. But maybe COVID has had a positive impact on that.
I mean, I recruit for all sorts of different size businesses in the London market, and you know, some of them might have 5 employees, some of them might have 5,000. So I see a whole range of different benefits packages and flexibility arrangements. And yes, COVID undoubtedly has made things better in a lot of companies, but now I think there's a bit of a negative trend I've noticed in the last 6 months. Companies are trying to push people back into the office more. I get that, I think we all get that collaboration and face-to-face contact is really important, but they're being less sympathetic. I've seen this towards women with kids, and I'm seeing that that's splitting which companies women can work for now. They can only work for the companies that, and that shouldn't be if there's a company which has better prospects for that particular woman, but she has to choose the company with the better benefits, that's not fair, is it? No. So I think getting consistency of benefits and working arrangements across the market would massively help.
Yeah, but I also think though, if just moving on from that, if you're really stripping this back to the sort of the root of the problem, I mean, I've had 3 children, my husband works, I've always worked. The root of the problem actually that has been for me, and I think there is this problem, is we need to get change in the sort of culture and the stigma around males participating in family life, because actually we're all sort of sitting on this precipice where it's the lady in the family, the woman in the family is their responsibility. So yes, someone needs to do something. The man goes to work, and the woman needs the flexibility. The woman needs the help. The woman needs the support. But actually, if they worked better as a team, and that was equal, then it gives both the male and the female in the relationship who are working more equality. And what we're wanting is equality. We're not necessarily wanting people to expect us to have everything for nothing, or to bend over backwards for us. I don't think that's what my aim is. So I think one of the key things here is that we have to change that culture and that stigma around men. I mean, actually, there is still a huge stigma, I suspect, around men. Sort of saying, "Oh well, no, my wife's got to go to work. It's now my turn to be late because the child's sick or whatever." So I think that would be a really sort of core kind of change that we can focus on.
Sorry. I was just going to say, I think with paternity leave and maternity leave, I think the more men that embrace paternity leave and set that example, the better, because then it becomes the norm, doesn't it? As opposed to, I don't know, obviously your company has to offer that, but take it, like shout out to them men. Grab it while you can.
Yeah. Well, there's an underwriter in the market who are really pushing for men to take 6 months off once they have a child, which I know a female in the company, and she was like, it's amazing to see because he's embracing that. So she's like, when it comes to me one day, like it's like embrace, like it's everyone does it, and it kind of turns everything on its head a bit, that this is normal for men to do it as well and have that time as well as women, and it's worked really well, and it's created like a positive change at that particular underwriter. So
right, that's really good.
Yeah.
And as long as there's no stigma around it,
yeah,
it's all very well offering it. No,
and then
nobody's going to take it because they think they're not going to get promoted.
Yeah. Embrace it head on.
Yes.
It's going to Germany for 6 months, I think. So, yeah.
Got to get away from this.
So it's that discrimination, it's breaking those sort of internalised assumptions that, women have to be the child carer, or, you're going to discriminate against somebody because, they can't be in the senior position of power because they might have to choose between family, etc., etc. But other than that sort of discrimination that we've just spoken about, how do you think sort of attitudes towards women have sort of changed over the years? Have we got still a long way to go in the market, whether that's in terms of obviously unconscious bias that Melanie spoke about, sexism, discrimination against family, etc.? How do you think that sort of evolved over the years, or has it not, and how long do we have to go?
I think we have got a long way. I mean, the world has changed. I was talking to Karen earlier. The world has changed. We used to work together a long time ago. And, it used to be basically that the women in the market were secretaries, and the males in the market were the brokers and the underwriters, and you had a good splattering of sort of junior lawyers, in my world. But generally, that was largely the picture. There has been progress, and there are more women in broker jobs, underwriter jobs. But you see those statistics, and it's rather gloomy, isn't it? Because I think there's still a long way to go. I think there needs to be more focus. I mean, it was interesting what Melanie said about the 268 years or whatever. I know that there are some countries that have introduced very draconian legislation to make change overnight, something called the golden skirt in certain jurisdictions, where overnight they pretty much said you've got to change the percentage of your board from 2% to 40%. And it's known as the golden skirt because there aren't enough women to do it, so they all get paid a load of money because they've got to sit on all these boards. I think probably, my view is it does take some time, and I think to do properly it does take some time. But there's a long way to go.
The more women you see, the better and easier it will become as well. Like even holding panels like this and educating people. And when I was initially in the Big Four, I was working for KPMG, and I'd heard of insurance, but I'd only known like my male friends in insurance, so that didn't put me off, but it didn't certainly encourage me to go. And then one of my female friends, actually over here, Becky, she joined the market. And I was like, well, that's instantly more accessible. Like, there's someone I relate to, someone I can chat to about this, someone who looks like me, she's a female. Like, it instantly makes it more open to people. And I think also in senior positions, if you can get more women there who stay there and promote, like, if you see yourself somewhere, you feel like you can go there as well. So, and any form of representation, but yeah, for women as well.
Definitely. I think when I first joined the market 13 years ago, there was hardly any representation of women in the Lloyd's building itself. I walked in and I was like, there is not.
There's only Karen. It was me.
Yeah, so I was on the 4th floor, you must have been on a different one. But like, there was nobody, and I walked in and I was just like, this is strange. Like, I feel a bit out of my depth here. Like, there's nobody that looks like me.
Intimidating.
Yeah, it was a bit intimidating, but not really easily scared. So I was like, you know what, I'm just going to embrace it, and it's worked out. And I think, like, going into the market now, going into that building, you see a lot more women, you see people of colour, you see like a lot more diversity, which just 13 years ago it wasn't there. So the market has come a long way, but I think there's still a long way to go. And in terms of like hiring people, I think, when you hire grads, sometimes the females aren't paid as much as the males are, and the males will be given different opportunities that the females aren't given, and then that gap begins there. So as you go down the chain to more senior positions, it's a lot more difficult to fill those, and then there's only going to be a couple of people in the market that can do that. Like you mentioned, like you'll get one woman that sits on multiple boards. So yeah, I think there's a long way to go, and that time frame that you mentioned earlier, like I can see how they got to that, but
there's still that internalised assumption that the sector is male dominated. It has to start from the beginning. Like when you're hiring people, you have to take off gender, take off names, take off anything that you might have an unconscious bias towards, and then from that moment onwards, you take it on a level playing field.
That's quite interesting, because I guess I find when there's a particular niche role to fill, I don't really see much gender bias. Thankfully, that's a positive thing. I've not really been asked by many people to take names off, or because, and actually, if you look at our stats internally, there's very equal numbers of hiring both genders, but the problem comes retaining. I find that's the main challenge. I think people will want to stay at companies for longer if they're rewarded and they can progress, but a lot of women find it harder to vocalise that a lot of the time, and they don't want to be seen as pushy or bossy. So I think sometimes companies have a role to play in kind of talking to women about their progression opportunities, giving them a little bit more of a nudge. That could possibly help the situation. And then later on, in terms of retention, childcare's going to be a massive part of it, isn't it? I think, I don't know an exact change, but I know the government's recently changed it. They're offering more hours, aren't they, for women, babies off a certain age, which is great. That has to come from the top down. But yeah, anything else to help childcare would be a huge help to women, to retain them.
Yeah. I also think coming back after maternity leave, we just had a lady come back, must be like incredibly daunting. Like there's new faces around, like your clients are being looked after by someone else. You don't automatically just slip back into a role and everything's as it was. So So it's trying to like engage those people and make them feel like this is back where they should belong, and like encourage them to want to stay and not feel on the sidelines. And obviously their priorities change as well. So embracing that, I definitely think from the top that will also come down, making sure that people are embraced back into the work.
Definitely, I think maternity policies are obviously a massive thing, and obviously empowering those women when they do obviously come back to work. But I guess, what else do you think the market can do to sort of promote gender equity and also challenge obviously the unconscious bias Melanie spoke about? Is it about breaking those sort of internalised assumptions ultimately to sort of actually action fair representation? Because you don't just want to be seen as like a box ticking company that's like, I'm going to employ you because you're a woman. How do you actually change it so you're employing them on their credit and nothing to do with the fact that they're a woman, but you don't have that sort of unconscious bias behind it?
I mean, I think there's a lot of box ticking going on. My view is that there has to be some sort of accountability right at the top for this sort of change in education, culture, all these changes. You know, lots of people have mission statements, tick box, move on. And that just isn't enough. But you see, I don't think there is accountability at top level.
Yeah, I think you've got to have those open conversations from the top down and the bottom up, because I think at the moment I'm hearing a lot more about like reverse mentoring, and I think that can be implemented like across any field. So just speaking to people, like if you think first of all, like acknowledging you have a problem is just part of solving the problem, right? So speaking to each other, saying like, actually, did I not look at that CV because that name sounded a bit different to what I would like to see in that position? Is that too female? Is that too male? Do I have to fill this in, or can I wait for somebody else? Like, you know, you've got to really acknowledge why you want to solve something, because if you don't admit it, and I think a lot of people don't, nobody wants to be criticised, but I think just having those open discussions, like I'm quite lucky where I currently work, the board have just said to me, tell us what the issues are, because we might not be aware of them, so like we need you to say it. And I was like, yeah, that's absolutely fine. You might not be prepared for that, but I will tell you. But just having that openness is vital, and then dealing with it. So if you notice that something's not right, like spend time with those people. I saw something on Instagram the other day, and it basically was like a people library in the Netherlands or somewhere where you can speak to refugees or people that look different to you, and you just address those biases just by speaking to those people and just saying like, actually, I'm completely in the wrong here, I'm so sorry, I didn't know what you've been through, your experiences are completely different and they're completely valid, and actually you bring a different perspective to this that we might not have previously.
I don't know if you wanted to speak there. Yeah, no, I completely think, I do really think it is challenging your own sort of assumptions as well, and I don't think it's about, you know, what do the men do to sort of break the stigma. I think even as females, I feel like you do hold your own assumptions that say you aren't as deserving as your male counterpart, etc., etc. But I think, you know, representation obviously has increased, as we've seen from the stats I showed before. But in your experiences, in your positions, do you think we are getting there in terms of fair representation? Are we meeting the quotas? Are we seeing more women in higher positions of power? I mean, you're from different sort of companies, so I want to know your own experiences and that across the board.
Well, the stats spoke for themselves, didn't they? That you know, it's happening, but slowly. And I think there's some great initiatives out there that are helping. I think, you know, the LMA and the London Market Group, London Insurance Life, which is an Instagram page which, you know, highlights lots of young people coming into the market. I think anything that can reach out to people in, you know, different formats is great. But that's going to take time. You know, these are all people coming in at a young age, aren't they? So, and a lot of the older generation won't be paying any attention to those websites or Instagram feeds because they don't use it.
And as you said before, it's about retention. Because, you know, on LinkedIn, every other person or every person who's got a senior hire is now a woman. So, I mean, I see it all the time. Woman. I mean, but actually, I think the stats said for every one of those, you know, 2 are leaving. But how long does that woman last? They don't last very long. They then soon get replaced by a man.
They might also get pinched though, because you have like such a limited talent pool. you have job offers like every other day, and then at one point you're going to have to take it. But I think you've just got to I think the market is getting better. It is going to take a long time, but then also like you've got to have that talent pool like coming up through the ranks. You can't just keep it as it is.
So how do we increase that representation then? Fairly, not just by box ticking. How do we empower women to get to senior positions for their own credit?
There's a point around, I know that there's the gender pay gap as well, and often it can be because one of the reasons, multiple, it's like complex, I understand, but one of it is like men can be quite dominating in how they go in to ask for pay and are talking to other men, so it gets reciprocated. Women can often, this is completely stereotypically, be a bit softer and not as pushy, and I don't think that should be a reason for them not to get the pay. It's that people should deal with like managing people in a different way, and like responding to someone who maybe isn't as bolshy, you can still respond to them and give them that even if they're not directly asking it. And it's about recognising different behaviours and patterns rather than just saying, well, they weren't stamping their fist on the desk, so they're not going to get it. And I think that could be a way, because I think all of us would agree here, if you found someone doing the exact same job as you, you're doing it just as well, if not better, and they're getting paid more, it's a kick in the teeth, and that you lose trust and faith in the company. You don't want to stay there anymore. You feel undervalued. So I think that would be a big thing to, I'm not saying everything's about money, but definitely encourage people to feel valued and stay.
But that can also work in terms of promotion as well. I think women, stereotypically are less likely to ask for that promotion as well, and then obviously you've got the problems, it falls into the stats of you don't see as many women in higher positions of power because they're not saying, okay, well, am I getting promoted? So how do we do that? How do we do that in a fair way? How do we increase that representation?
I think you educate people as well. Tell the top bosses, women don't do it, but recognise talent. Like you don't have to, if you're good enough, you shouldn't have to scream about it. It should be recognised by your output.
Yeah, I think more and more, like, if your own employer doesn't recognise it, somebody else will. Like, that's the current market that we're in. So I think it's really important for companies to recognise people, not just women, like men, women, anyone that is showing valid credibility in their marketplace. I think it's important to also not go too far the other way as well. I've seen instances where men aren't being promoted because the company's like, oh no, we need to hit this quota, and I'm just like, no, you need to just hire the best position, like the best people for the job. So I think that's very important, and it's finding that right balance, but I don't know, it is very much a box ticking exercise at the minute, and it's not going to work.
But also you're more likely to get promoted. I mean, if you're talking about women with children, I know that's not everybody, but it's a large sort of chunk of the the issue here. Women are more likely to get promoted if they can contribute more, if the men aren't stigmatised for helping with the family. So again, it goes back to that sort of root issue, and I think that there's a it's really sort of taking things back, stripping them back to those issues that companies need to think about this. I mean, this isn't rocket science. I mean, this should all be worked out if they're wanting to work it out. I don't think it's that difficult. I just ask myself, do they want to work it out?
And then that obviously falls into the retention levels. So I guess, how do we empower women to want to stay at these companies? Should it be diversity and inclusion training? Should it be holding events like this? Like, what is it that is going to make those females want to stay?
So I think it's important that you obviously pay the right person for the job, and I think flexibility is very important. I think I've come across different companies where they've openly said, like, look, we know that between 8 and 9:30, like, a lot of people are dropping their kids to school, so like we don't start our work day till 10 o'clock. So people can do that, or we let people go early in case they need this. Like, we have special holiday allowances for half term because we know that you're going to need it more then, or we've got an in-house creche because then you can work and you can see your kids. You don't need to worry about what they're doing or who they're with. So like, I think it's just giving them the opportunities and the options to be able to still do their job, but like make it more equitable for them. So like they're on the same level playing field as their male counterparts.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I don't know if anyone has any questions for our lovely panel. I think that sums it up quite nicely. That I think, it is about breaking that stigma ultimately, I think, to challenge the sort of gender stereotypes in insurance. I think that's the only way we can basically see fairer representation across the board and not just hitting quotas just to prove a point or just to meet your goals. So I don't know if anyone has any questions for our lovely panel.
No, I have a comment though.
Yeah.
I do think that the older generation are shifting out into retirement, bringing in that newer generation with the thought processes that is what's going to help us all get through this. I was that person you were talking about in the fact that when I went on maternity leave 35 years ago, there was no maternity leave. You were sent home and see you later.
Yeah.
That was my life.
But also,
there was no job.
I mean, all my life I've been called a working mother.
Yeah.
You know, I actually said to my daughter the other day, she's 21, and I said, oh, you know, being called a working mother, it doesn't thrill me that much. And she said, oh, I've never heard that term.
That just goes to show our age, Kate.
So actually, I think you're
Yes.
right. I think but that's because this is about education, and you know, they're educated, they understand the issues more instinctively. So I think it will change, but you've probably got another, you know, 25 years of the old sort
Lloyd's
of farce
didn't have a woman
in there.
until what, 1986? A woman in Lloyd's?
No.
The only women in Lloyd's before that were making the tea.
And we still haven't had a chair of female
No,
chair.
we still haven't had a
Still
chair.
haven't.
And I think
Shocking.
that's exactly it. The old school, you know, the boys' club is moving out,
Yeah.
and the newer generations are coming in. And I know it's going to take a while.
But maybe it's better
But
if
it's
it takes a
happening.
while. And if it takes a while,
Slowly.
it might actually work.
Have an impact.
Be real and work well for
Yeah.
everybody, rather than just be this sort of
Yeah.
illusion and facade that then crumbles.
Yeah.
You know, a few years later.
Because
So I
I've
think
seen the
sometimes-
change in Lloyd's.
Yeah.
We spoke earlier, didn't we?
Yeah.
When I first started in Lloyd's, I've only been in the insurance market for about 8 years. When I left working with Kate, I walked into Lloyd's and I was one of a tiny amount of women. And now you can walk in there, I know it's a bit empty now, but you walk in now and there is a lot more women. Even on my floor, on the underwriting floor, there's a lot more, I was saying, a lot more colour, because there's less suits on my floor.
You think that's the new generation?
That's the new generation coming in. We've got lots of new blood coming in. So it is, and I think Axis in general have changed that internally. Yeah, maybe the figures might not show that, but I know they are up there with one of the higher, you know, gaps. You know, they've got less gap. But they are working on it, and it is something that I think as a company, I think they're doing very well at. You know, and I think it's just really nice to see it changing and to be part of that change. Because I'm that older generation where you want to see the younger people coming through, you know, and get the maternity leave that they want and get the paternity leave. My boss, male, loves spending time with his children. Him and his wife have it all diarised, who's doing what pickup, who's, you know, they can't wait to go and see their kids at school in the play, and that's how it should be. It shouldn't be that the mum has to attend and dad stays at work. They both go together.
Yeah.
You know,
And just to add to that, because I'm living through it with my husband at the moment, and we both like completely share the pickups, the drop-offs, like he has to leave the pickup for nursery because she's sick and stay at home, and all that kind of stuff. But it's also like we want to be that sort of parent, and we want to be that kind of role model, both to our children, but also to the people that we work with. Like that's how it should be, and if there is a stigma attached, well, tough. Like this is what we want and how we want to live our lives and have a career and have a family.
Yeah.
It shouldn't
No, there shouldn't be the stigma.
but if you can empower the men to want to do that as well,
Yeah.
I know we're talking about empowering women to take control,
Yeah.
but the men need to be empowered to say, you know what, I don't care what you're all saying,
Yeah.
I'm going to my kids' nursery,
Yeah.
I'm going to the school play, I'm taking the day-to-day because we want to go to Chessington, you know,
Or you can stick your job.
or you can stick your job and I'll go and work for a company who are willing to do, you know, retention. But yeah, I do think it's happening, and we do have to empower men to be able to take that responsibility, because there is still more men,
Yeah.
and you're still going to have maybe the older generation who'll go, you're going to school play, you know,
Yeah.
you're still going to have that. Not for long, hopefully, as they all go into retirement
It's
and,
that growth mindset.
you know, yeah, and the new blood comes through.
Any other questions? I think I saw a few hands. Who wants to go first?
Yeah, it's more of a comment again, but I think we keep talking about equality, and I think partly the reason that it will take a long time, and I think it'll only work if it takes a longer period of time, is that I think what's really important is that women and men recognise that the sexes are different and the genders are different, and I know that you know, in that comes automatic stereotyping, but it's true. And if you look at and some of that is not necessarily because of you know, a natural makeup, but some of it is because of this insidious kind of culture that we've had around us for so long. But you know, you will, when I've been looking at a lot of statistics coming up to today, and you can see that in workplaces, you know, men are much more ready to, even if they're not qualified for that particular project, to say, yeah, I'll head that up. And a woman who is more qualified to head up that project will say, well, I'll help. You know, and there's a natural instinct there for men to, you know, step up to the mark, and there's a natural instinct for women to kind of, you know, do the back work, the back office work. And I think that's really important for employers to recognise and to tackle, and to, you know, to make sure that they have mentors in place who are actively, positively encouraging the confidence in women and training women in those discussions, training women to have meaningful discussions with their employers, how to approach appraisals, how to approach pay reviews, because there's no one else that's, you know, going to be able to pick them up and do that. But the other thing with this education is it's really important for men to be educated on the female experience of life generally and work. So, you know, hormones, pregnancy, miscarriage, you know, things that really affect us in terms of how we can function day-to-day life, but also at work. And those things that end up taking those 66%, you know, it's great to see that statistic, but you know that in 5 years, 10 years, if you follow that 66%, it's just going to whittle down and down. It's not going to keep at 66. And what is it in the life cycle of a woman that means, as well as her workplace environment, that means that 66% comes down?
Definitely, no, thank you very much for that. Sandra, did you have a...
Yes, just a quick question. So we talk about, and as mentioned before, I am sad to not see more men taking part of this conversation, because that's where the education that we give here is going from. But it's so many women taking part of this conversation. But I guess my question is, we know what we should do as women, or we know what we should see happening for us to grow. But how can we foster that growth without going against what we feel that it's us? If we are more gentle, if we are more empathic, if we are talking about how amazing I am is self-marketing and I don't do that. How can we, what tricks can we do that will position us in a better position and without going against what we are or how we were educated? Because I think most of it, and I had a quick conversation before, that is, it comes from education. We are educated to be kind, educated to be nice, to be the little princess. So how can we be better in position ourselves without going against what our values are?
I mean, it's such a good point, you know, is that what comes out of that is that it's so important that we are what we are. You know, there's so many women who are trying to be like men, and I think historically this actually, and certainly my generation, you both, actually how we've tackled this in the past is successful women have actually tried to be like men. And to some extent that has worked. You know, that's quite a good ruse to sort of work your way through a commercial, this world. But that's, you know, that's not equality. And I mean, and just going back to your question, I mean, I think the way you're going to get tricks is actually something that Melanie mentioned. You know, having mentors, having people that can teach you, guide you in ways to be confident and courageous without losing your you. The fact that you are maybe empathetic, the fact that you want to approach things differently. So, you know, I think it is perhaps finding mentors that can help you feel comfortable about who you are what you're contributing, not change, don't put on a black suit, but at the same time to be courageous and confident. Yeah.
Saying we don't do well.
I don't think that's just limited to gender though, because I don't know, most companies these days do some kind of personality testing, and sometimes you get men who fall into that sector as well. I think a lot of the time doing personality testing and sharing the results with your companies is actually a real learning curve, and you know then how to interact with that person and respond. So I think that should be, all companies should do that.
Yeah, yeah.
I think also you do have to sing your own praises. I think because if you don't, nobody else is going to do them for you. So have that confidence to speak to your employers and say, actually, you know what, I've been making a list of all the good jobs that I've done this year, and I wanted to discuss them at my appraisal. Here's what I think my weaknesses are, and here's how I'm addressing them. Here's what proactive steps I'm taking to progress with this or that. Because there's no harm in being soft and gentle, but I think don't let it detriment your own career and your own growth, because if you don't do it, nobody else is going to do it for you. So like, just speak to them openly. Like, work for a company where you can have those conversations and speak to your boss openly and just say, actually, I did do a great job. And before you even say it, like if your boss can come to you and say, wow, that was incredible, you nailed that pitch, you did a fantastic presentation. I've got Clodagh here that I work with, and she's incredible, you know, like she delivers every single time. I think you need to empower graduates right up to director level to say, actually have those conversations, because if you are doing a great job, we might recognise it, but by the time appraisal comes around, you might have forgotten about it. There's 10 other appraisals that you've got in your diary to get through that day. So it's your job to highlight those things, and it will only help you.
I'd also say like embrace them as well. Like those which would, if being a softer character can also get you further, because you see things completely differently to how a guy would see it, or a man in that position would see it. Like that's the reason we employ diverse, isn't it? You want different perspectives, and that can get you far by also embracing a different approach. Not everyone can go in and be stereotypically hardball and bad cop. You need to be who you are, and if that's kinder, if that's softer, if that's still got a massive place in the market, and that's a way to work well still. So I think it's embracing that rather than changing it ever.
Definitely. Well,
Sorry, just one last one, because obviously we're talking a lot about how much time it'll take for things to improve, and I get it will take some time. Do you not think that there's things that could be done sooner? And also, as an industry and a marketplace, what companies and what are we doing to promote which ones are doing it really well and showcasing them, and so others will follow suit? I don't think, I mean, I personally don't really know that many out there of who's done a really good job initially at addressing the gender pay gap. Like, who's really promoting women, like who's doing it well?
Yeah, I completely agree. I wouldn't think of a broker and be like, oh, they're great for women. Like, it's not necessarily publicised that openly. Like, there should be a more open forum about it.
But if they were, would people not say, look at these? They're, you know, shouting out about how great they are with women. Would that not have a derogatory effect sometimes on people?
Yeah.
Because they're all of a sudden they're doing one thing for women, and they're shouting it from the rooftops. It's
even
like,
if there's
look at
places
me,
you
look
could
at
see
me.
more
I'm
women
doing,
in higher places,
you know,
though, which was
yeah,
as a stat, and then if you look at that, that would automatically make me feel a bit more encouraged to go interview there. One, I don't know if you saw that there was 4 women on the board who had all come up similar paths. It's not just the hiring gap; they've stayed there and they've been developed like that. That'd be massive and obviously exciting.
It's the retention again, isn't it? It's keeping those people.
But I think it's prioritising though. Yeah. I mean, I think it's actually prioritising the importance of this social issue. Mm-hmm. You know, Lloyd's prioritises financial issues like solvency, We all know about those. You get any of that wrong, you know, you're sacked, and your Carnegie Brown resigns. Okay, but all the social issues are not given the priority. You know, there is no accountability. It's all the soft stuff. Oh, let's have a BI policy. No one's accountable. No directors are accountable. No one's accountable. But that's because it isn't prioritised as a business. You know, as a business.
But is there businesses at all that are prioritising it, and they can be, again, like publicised or, just promoted within the industry? That
ours does publicise on like LinkedIn in the fact that they have they have quite a large diversity and inclusion committee, and they were all from all walks of life in order to bring all their points of view in, and they do meet literally regularly. There's always some meeting going on, and it is changing the company. We're seeing it changing the company. Are they shouting it from the rooftops? Maybe not. Maybe the odd thing on LinkedIn, but it's not like massive. But they are making changes within the company, not necessarily, you know, out on the big wide press moment. No one's going to apply there thinking, oh, I'll go there because they've got a great diversity and inclusion committee. But they are making changes.
I guess some.
I'm just gonna
You go.
The question I wanted to ask, since we want to see change, especially in senior leadership as a woman, I think a lot of topics like women's rights or women in the workplace, it becomes like sometimes deemed as negative by other peers or other men. How do we interact with our employers or hire senior leadership and get them involved and get the rest of the colleagues like wanting to see that change for a better working environment for women?
I mean, I think that comes down to education again, I'm afraid. You know, I think if people are well educated and they understand the issues, they understand the benefits, they understand the advantages, they understand what the problem is, then I think, you know, I think that's central to it, personally.
Yeah, I think to wrap up, I think the key takeaways I take from this is one, education, and that comes from, you know, ourselves, it comes from your employers, and it also comes from everyone as a society. I say empowerment, you know, empowering yourself, empowering your colleagues, empowering females to get to those higher leadership levels, and also literally what Caitlin said, own it, like, and Cad, like, own your own successes. And I think the more you push about, you know, how much of a positive impact women can make, the more change is going to occur in the market. But I think, you know, as we've all spoken about, it's a collective effort. You know, it can't just come from women, it has to be a sort of collective ally involvement. But I think, yeah, we obviously are starting to see change, and I think with more and more D&I initiatives obviously kicking off, as long as we all sort of take that on board and actually don't carry on that discrimination, I think the market can definitely advance in its sort of male-dominated current environment.